On that sweltering summer day, when the sun relentlessly flooded the sky, our house sank into lazy silence. My mom, Elizabeth, had gone on a long business trip, leaving me, Hannah, a first-year college student, alone. The house was at my complete disposal, like a palace waiting for me to seize its freedom. My father, Mark, had just returned from visiting his brother, but instead of staying home, he soon left to meet an old friend. Again and again, the newly found freedom felt like a rare trophy. Closing the front door, I shed my day clothes like armor and put on my favorite pajamas like a second skin. The soft fabric gave me a sense of security that I had been missing. The embrace of silence beckoned, inviting me to forget about the chores. Taking my laptop and a glass of sparkling lemonade, I sprawled out on the living room couch, ready to immerse myself in the boundless expanses of the internet. Headphones became my fortress, drowning out the world beyond the cozy living room. With the sound of clicks, I jumped from one video to another, wandering along the secret paths of virtual space. Time became an incorporeal cloud, easily slipping through my fingers. It seemed to me that my father, Mark, would be absent for a few more hours, but anxiety washed over me like a sudden gust of wind. Through the sound barrier in the headphones, a voice came through, low, stern, full of bewilderment. "Hannah, what are you doing?" I froze at that sharp sound. I hadn't noticed him come in. His figure stood motionless in the doorway, his face stony, his eyes burning with a mix of shock and embarrassment. Silently, he turned and left, and the sound of the closing door echoed in the ensuing silence. My thoughts froze like still water in a mountain river. Shame washed over me in waves, leaving me helpless. Finally, gathering courage, I got up and found him. He was standing in the kitchen, his face pale, as if all the color had drained from it. "Dad, I'm really sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I didn't hear you come in. I promise it won't happen again." He sighed, lowering his gaze. "Just be more careful, Hannah," he replied softly and went to the stove to start cooking. The rest of the evening was filled with awkwardness. Conversations were reduced to short phrases, and time dragged on like fog over a field. But despite the lingering silence, it was clear. This strange, inexplicable rift in our relationship had only just begun to show itself. The awful awkwardness of that evening left its marks, like footprints in the sand after the tide. Mark, my father, spent the rest of the time in his office, as if that place could protect him from our silent clashes. I, in turn, hid in my room, but the calm was fleeting. Old habits, like unruly branches, pulled me back to familiar activities. I left the door to my room slightly ajar, thinking that this way I could avoid new surprises. But I was wrong. Under the cover of the sound of running water from the kitchen, my father unexpectedly headed towards my corner of the house. His steps were almost silent, but I felt his presence when I heard his voice behind me. "Hannah, it's okay," he said softly, his tone gentle but filled with a strange insistence. I shuddered, hurriedly closing the tabs on the computer screen. His sudden appearance caught me off guard, and anxiety was evident in my voice. "Dad, I didn't hear you come up." He nodded, looking at the screen for just a second, but that fleeting pause was enough for me to feel something inexplicable hanging between us. "I wanted to apologize for what happened earlier," he began, his voice tinged with doubt, as if he was still trying to make sense of his own words. "I overreacted. I didn't know what to say." His words sounded sincere, but the strangeness of the moment weighed heavily.
"I'm sorry, Dad, I mattered."
He sighed softly, avoiding my gaze. "It's okay, Hannah. Just be more careful, okay?" It seemed like the conversation was over, but instead he took a step further into the room. His face looked tense, as if he was about to say something significant. "Listen, at your age, it's natural to be curious," he said, carefully choosing his words. "I just want you to know that it's normal." His attempt to ease the situation instead of making things better only added to the strange tension. Finally, he left me alone. But there was a double meaning in his words that I couldn't ignore. That evening, sitting in the living room, I caught every rustle from the kitchen, every step he took. In our once cozy and predictable home, a strange instability had appeared. This feeling like a shadow crept up on me, leaving me wondering what would happen next. The next day, the house was filled with ghostly calm, as if the very air held its breath. Our paths with my father crossed, but each glance, each word was accompanied by awkwardness, as if we were moving on thin ice, afraid to break it. By evening, I retreated to my room again, immersed in my own thoughts. But he found me. My father knocked, slightly opened the door, and peeked inside with an uncertain smile. "Can I come in?" I nodded, unable to say a word. He entered, his steps cautious, as if he was afraid to disturb the fragile silence. "Hannah," he began, sitting on the edge of my bed, "we need to talk." My heart trembled like a string under tension. "About what, Dad?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, as if gathering his thoughts. "I want you to understand what happened between us. It's not typical. Most fathers and daughters don't discuss such topics." His words drowned in tension. "I know," I replied, trying to make my voice sound firm, although everything inside me was shaking. "Do you mean we should stop?" His eyes, dark and tired, met mine. "No," he said, his voice soft but confident. "I don't want you to think I'm pushing you away or judging you. All I'm trying to say is that I'm still your father. And I want you to know that you can count on me." Those words, so simple and deep, hit me like a tidal wave. "Thank you, Dad," I muttered, feeling a strange relief wash over me. He leaned forward, reaching out to gently pat me on the shoulder. "Just know that I'm here. Without judgment. If you need to talk about anything, don't hesitate." The words sounded sincere, but their weight hung in the air like a storm cloud. When he stood up, I noticed a slight smile on his face, as if he felt more confident after the conversation. "Good night, Hannah." "Good night, Dad," I replied, watching him leave. When the door closed, I was left alone with a whirlwind of emotions swirling in my head. The boundary between us was blurring, becoming something new and unfamiliar. The air was filled with the question, what next? The next morning, the house was filled with familiar sounds. The rustling of newspapers, the gurgling of the coffee maker, the melodic clinking of dishes. But behind this normality lurked the shadow of our recent conversations, like an invisible web connecting every movement. Mark, my father, stood at the stove, preparing breakfast with a focused look. His hands moved confidently, but I caught tension in his shoulders. It was as if something inside him was struggling to break free. I joined him in the kitchen, trying to look calm, although inside I was bubbling with worry. "Good morning, Dad," I said, sitting down at the table. He turned and gave me a warm but slightly forced smile. "Good morning, Hannah. How did you sleep?" "Not bad, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. We had breakfast in relative silence, but it was tense, as if each of us was choosing our words with extreme care. When I finished, he suddenly cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Hannah, I've been thinking," he began, pushing his plate aside. "We need to set some boundaries." My heart sank like a stone thrown into a deep well. "Boundaries?" He nodded, his gaze serious but kind. "Yes, I think it's important. It will help both of us feel comfortable." I froze, waiting for him to continue. "First of all," he continued, "what we discuss should stay between us. This is our personal territory, and your mom shouldn't know." I nodded, feeling relieved by his certainty. "Of course. I agree. Secondly," he hesitated for a moment, "if you're going to spend time in the living room, just let me know. I don't want to catch you off guard again." "That's fair," I said, lowering my gaze to my hands. He sighed, and his tone softened. "And finally, if you need to talk about anything, I'm always here. You can be completely open with me, Hannah. Without shame." I looked at him, surprised by his openness. "Thank you, Dad," I said sincerely. His gaze softened, and he smiled slightly. "All I want is to be your support, Hannah. Everything else is just details." That conversation left a strange feeling in my soul. There was something comforting about it, but at the same time, it brought the realization that we were entering uncharted territory. The rest of the day passed quietly. We both tried to maintain the normality we knew before, but the shadow of what had happened remained with us. That evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I caught myself thinking that much had changed. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with thin threads of new understanding. Every scene of the movie, every word seemed filled with new meaning. And although I tried to focus on the screen, my thoughts kept returning to our breakfast conversation. I knew this was just the beginning of a journey full of questions that we still had to find answers to. The week dragged on like a sticky swamp. My father and I tried to stick to the established rules, and this helped maintain a fragile semblance of normality. But the silence between us was still burdened with unspoken thoughts. It was the calm before the storm, a premonition of something bigger, something inevitable. One evening, when the house was quiet, I decided to watch a nature documentary. It was my way of finding solace in the situation. The huge screen in the living room came to life, filling the room with stunning views of the savannah. Lionesses hunted under the melodic voice of the narrator, and I, as if hypnotized, watched their grace and strength. But the solitude didn't last long. Mark entered the living room with a glass of wine in his hand and a light smile on his face. "Can I join you?" he asked casually, nodding at the screen. I hesitated but nodded. "Of course, Dad." He sat down next to me, leaving a decent distance between us, but his presence was palpable, like warmth from a fire. For a while we sat in silence, allowing the sounds of the documentary to fill the space. It seemed like those moments of togetherness were more important than words. "This is incredible," he commented, pointing at the screen where a lioness slowly stalked her prey. "Look at her. So graceful, so strong." I smiled, feeling the lightness of his words slightly easing the atmosphere. "Yes," I agreed. "It's amazing how they work together to survive." He nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of wine. "It's a bit like life," he said, as if thinking aloud. "We also look for ways to survive, but our hunts are more emotional than physical." His words struck me like a gentle nudge from a wave. It was true. We were both going through our own hunt, attempts to cope with the changing dynamics between us. "And what attracts you to such films? The beauty or the danger?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me a little longer than usual. I hesitated slightly, pondering his question. "Probably both," I admitted. "There's something real about them. No falseness, just pure life as it is." He smiled, satisfied with my answer. "Well said, Hannah. I think that's an important lesson for all of us, to be real." We watched the film to the very end, occasionally exchanging insignificant comments. But behind this outward lightness, there was something more, something we both were afraid to voice. When the film ended, he stood up, stretching slightly. "Thanks for the company, Hannah. It was nice." "I enjoyed it too, Dad," I replied, genuinely glad that at least one evening had passed peacefully. He nodded, and his gaze softened. "You know I'm always here, right? If you ever need to talk." His words sounded reassuring, but they left a slight trail of mystery. When he left the room, I remained sitting on the couch, pondering his behavior. Something was changing. A new dynamic was emerging between us, not yet fully understood but increasingly palpable. That night, lying in bed, I looked at the ceiling and tried to piece together all the fragments of this complex puzzle. One thing was clear. We were both at a crossroads where the familiar and the new collided, creating a complex web of relationships. Time dragged on like honey slowly dripping from a spoon. With each passing day, the tension between me and Mark seemed more familiar, as if it had become part of our rhythm. But despite the outward calm, I felt that everything we had built over the past few weeks, like a sandcastle, could crumble at any moment. In the evening, when the smell of the cooking dinner filled the house, I went into the kitchen. My father stood at the stove, focused on flipping pancakes. He looked unusually calm, but his tense shoulders gave away that he was deep in thought. "Hannah," he said without taking his eyes off the pan, "there's something I want to talk about." I froze like a taut rope, not knowing what to expect. "About what?" I asked cautiously, trying to keep my voice neutral. He turned off the stove, put down the spatula, and turned to me. His gaze was serious but gentle, as if he was choosing his words carefully so as not to disrupt the fragile balance. "Tomorrow your mom comes back," he began, "and I think that will change the dynamics in our house." I nodded, understanding where he was going. "Do you mean we should stop?" His eyes lingered on me, then he sighed heavily. "Not exactly. I just want us to be careful. Whatever happens, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. We've talked about a lot of things and I want you to know this doesn't make us different people. I'm still your father, and you're still my daughter." Those words, though cloaked in confidence, seemed fragile, like autumn leaves ready to break under the slightest pressure. "I understand," I said softly, "and I'm grateful that you've been there for me, Dad." He smiled, and his face reflected a strange mix of relief and sadness. "I'm proud of you, Hannah. You're growing up and it's not easy. I just want you to know that I'm always here if you need me." We spent dinner in relative silence, which was more soothing than tense. We both understood that this was a sort of finale, after which much would change. The next morning Mom returned. Her familiar presence filled the house with warmth and stability that we might have been missing. But at the same time, it became a boundary beyond which our recent revelations were hidden. Life returned to its usual routine, but something in our home had changed. Our bond with my father had become deeper, stronger. We no longer discussed those conversations, but their echo remained with us, like an invisible bridge between the past and the present. Weeks turned into months, but the summer that changed us remained in my memory as a bright beacon. We both became closer, although the path to it was not easy. Sometimes the most difficult trials lead us to unexpected revelations. About ourselves, about the people we love, and about the bonds that unite us. Mark, my father, remained someone I could always rely on. And although we both knew that we would never return to those revelations, that summer became an important chapter for us, quiet and intimate, forever changing us.